Well, good day. I apologize for any background noise. They're doing a bunch of spring cleanup in the neighborhood here. But I thought I'd just share something I noticed. My reading in the last couple days, yesterday in the morning, was Thomas Merton. I was able to read tons of his stuff. Just a wonderful thinker. I highly recommend Thomas Merton. If you, I read Thomas Merton on meaning and purpose. His book, what is it? The Seven Principles. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. He also wrote on Joyce and on literature. Highly recommend Thomas Merton on literature, and it was specifically Milton. Milton and Joyce and another Irishman, or a Scotsman actually, from the Orkneys. It was really quite interesting, and his take is really great. Ties in with Northrop Frye and Joseph Campbell and, endless lists. But I just thought I'd share today's read and some insights into some insights. So I'm reading Simply Nietzsche. It's a book really well done, actually, and for the life of me here, I can't remember the gentleman's name, the author. It's really well done. It's what's considered a primer. But as they say, it goes into deeper stuff. Peter Kale, a professor, and what I found interesting is just to let you know. So it's a primer, but it's got some insights. It explains a lot of misunderstandings. It talks about Nietzsche, but also his philosophy. And an example I'll give you is early on, they mentioned the term Ubermench, and it used to be translated as Superman. And the author says it's now commonplace to say the Overman. And so I just made a note of this, that it was an oversight, right? Because I personally use the term Ubermensch. I don't translate it. Okay, and this is what I wrote. So they do mention that Superman was controversial, and the more popular Overman was used. And I can attest this is a contentious issue. I once upset a fan of Nietzsche when I mentioned my dislike for the term of I think it was Overman. It was being used as Superman. But they misunderstood, as this book failed to explain, that Uber is an over and an under and a through, a way through, which is something that's important so you understand what Nietzsche is talking about here, particularly in this case, right? Because German, as I've said, is, you really do have to understand what he meant. It's difficult in English because, yes, many words can have multiple meanings attached to them, but for some reason we tend to gravitate to what we assume to be the meaning and ignore maybe some additional meaning, or maybe even some well, like they say in Joyce, that some of his meanings and references might just be gibberish, right? In an attempt to, like a Zen koan, right? To tie up the cognition so that you can see through. But I go on and explain, right, that the Superman gives a very wrong impression, as does to a lesser degree the term or the use Overman, right? As he said, as Fred said, we are the bridge to potential, and the Ubermensch is the inspiration over or towards a goal, right? To be a bridge rather than a jail, right? It's, autocorrect caught me there. I was trying to use the old spelling of jail, and it auto-corrected it to goal, so it just said to be a bridge rather than a goal. Still fits, but I'd rather play on, like Nietzsche would, play on that it looks like goal, but it's pronounced jail, right? But, yeah, that's what I thought I'd share, how important Nietzsche's Ubermensch is. Because this morning I'm re-listening to that book that I mentioned, Simply Nietzsche. And I really do enjoy that it's a small group of scholars that really do understand how important Nietzsche's philosophy is. And as he said to his buddy Ray, he felt, and I think he told Duysen too, that his Zarathustra would be our guide for the new millennium. And I don't know if he realized how right and yet how wrong he was. So I'm going to take a bit of advice, and I'm going to concentrate on what seems to matter. Right? And what seems to matter is meaning, value. And in the absence of any sort of a universal truth or truth of any kind, it seems, the nature of beyond good and evil, that we can carve for ourselves a new table of values. But that requires a template of sorts, right? And as Hemingway said, it's not honorable to be better than anyone else. It's only honorable to be better than your previous self. And if that can be your only goal, as Camus would entice, life is absurd, but dancing or simply embracing the absurdity can be as much a goal as a meaning as it can be value. Who was it that, Schopenhauer or Kant, Maupassant. I could come up with a dozen different examples where they talk about the importance. The Greeks would have said this, right? In the absence of any meaning or value, you can turn to simple aesthetics, right? Arguably, is aesthetics an early form of transvaluation or synchronicity to Jung? Is it possible that we've been taught these lessons for millennia and we've just tended to ignore it because of not the lack of free will, as many might suggest, but the lack of the courage to take a risk, right? To make those choices, not just for oneself, but to risk maybe breaking some eggs and maybe being hurt, but more importantly, hopefully finding meaning in the suffering, maybe even reducing it to some extent. But as I said before, if pain is 80% perception, well, so would suffering. So finding meaning in the suffering actually arguably changes its label, and it's no longer suffering. Very similar to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. Right? We label it as such because we simply don't have the courage to embrace it. This is Nietzsche's eternal return, his amor fati, right? The only way forward is to love your fate. And I go one step forward and say amor fides, to love your faith, right? So that's the eternal return. To not just say that you'd be willing to do it all over again, but to truly believe that, right? To, as I said, as Molly said in Ulysses, it's just to say yes. And Nietzsche would say yes. Yes, as Jung would say yes. Or Hunter S. Thompson, right? Buy the ticket and take the ride. Or the Bhagavad Gita, as Krishna would say, karma yoga. Karma yoga is the ultimate path to liberation, to understanding, to, the sixth sutra of the Usha Upanishad. My apologies, the Isha Upanishad, the sixth line, the sixth sutra, is to see the self in others and to see the other in yourself, right? You have a pronoun of we and us, but not forgetting the I. That's the real risk. And I think that's where Paul Tillich might have been right, and I don't think he went into this enough. The Courage to Be, that was a book that I read for a couple days earlier this week or on the weekend. This courage to be, that has to do with a courage to define who you are, right? I've talked about this before. Austin Kleon, influenced by philosophy, but, writing pop culture books, is not wrong when he says our job is to try to clone our idols right? Because it's what we look up to and it's what we want to be or how we see ourselves. But it's in the failure of cloning said idols that we achieve arguably what we were meant to be or who we are if we risk embarrassment and hurt and even injury with the goal to satiate this desire to reduce suffering. It's an oxymoron, right? To satiate desire in suffering. But that's what we're looking to do. I can't remember who said it. I think it was actually Thomas Merton. He said that contentment, and I think he was quoting, who was he quoting? Oh, I can't remember who he was quoting. But he said that contentment is simply that moment that we embrace our fate, when we accept our lot, when we carry our burden, when we find the meaning in our suffering. Not when suffering ceases, but when we cease to perpetuate the perspective that suffering is a defined experience or quality or even object, as Wittgenstein would say, right? Language is denoting objects. So in this case, the only reason why we see suffering as something horrible that we can't manage or we can't survive and get out the other side is because we label it as such, right? If we were to label life as challenging but rewarding, our perspective changes almost immediately. Right? So that's why I recommend a rereading of many of these great books. I think the next group read I might do might be either Carl Jung's Red Book, which I adore. I'm not sure if it's too advanced for most. Ion, I think, is also a great choice. Mainly because it has developed this reputation that it's an impenetrable book. I don't understand, because a Red Book is much more impenetrable. Jung's Ion is a fabulous book, and it gives a lot of these same sort of answers. The reason why I prefer the Red Book is Jung is very clear that a lot of this inspiration does come from Nietzsche. But that's neither here nor there. The reason why I mention it is because there's no sense in getting it secondhand when you can get it directly from the horse's mouth. You see the pun? Nietzsche himself in his Zarathustra, which is one of his last works before he ended up getting upset because somebody was whipping a horse. Right? So never look a gift horse in the mouth. Right? That's a little bit of advice many of us could take. Right? If the philosopher has ideas that give you an understanding, right? Again, I've talked about this. The meaning to science it goes back to the Latin word to understand, to come to know, knowledge. It's no different in German. The word for science in German has the connotation to understand life, right? Vicissitudes in English, this idea of Weltanschauung, or Weltanschauung is very similar. This way we live, where we find meaning and where we find ourselves and where we place ourselves. I mean, that is identity, that is meaning, that is value. You can't separate who you are from what you value. Same as you can't separate the culture or the mythos of your language, because your consciousness is born of the same, right? So that's just something I want to share for today. I think it's very important in this day and age to understand. And the reason why I mention it is most people don't understand that Nietzsche is not a philosopher. He was a philologist. He loved language and culture and classics, right? He was a classical philologist, meaning trained in the Greek. So a lot of these ideas are meant to be understood. Nietzsche's writing as a classicist, but also I think with an expectation that you will have had a classical education, right? So it's not just, as I said, some of these allusions, some of the words used, some of the archetypes, but it goes deeper than that. He makes mention of a number of different ideas. I mean, I actually will point to the backworldsmen or the afterworldsmen, the Hinterwäldlers. This idea, the chapter in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, where he talks about this colored vapor before a discontented God. But it can also be read as, are we disenchanted with God, or are we the discontented God, or the being? It's really quite a beautiful sentence. And that whole chapter, that's probably the first chapter. I actually realized this morning it might be smart to take some guidance from Nietzsche himself, Proust, and then James Joyce, or Hemingway, and maybe I could find myself publishing some of these annotated texts in syndication. So what I'm thinking is we could start with Hinterwäldler, not only translate, but also add a bunch of footnotes, essentially the annotated Zarathustra. I like the idea of a skeleton key to Zarathustra because it really is opening up not just the meaning, but the philosophy, and even the philosopher himself. And, I mean, isn't that what we're meant to do, right? To come to understand. Phronesis in Greek, right? Find ourselves to understand. Knowledge, wisdom, born of action, of effort, of endeavor. I mean, the definition of fides, of faith, of shraddha, is commitment, devotion, and confidence in whatever endeavor you devote your time, as I said before. So I've come to realize that I think beyond anything else, the most important thing that we can do for ourselves and each other is to find this meaning and this understanding of our experience. That, as I've said a million times before in my podcast, that it always surprised me giving tours in a museum that people took the Buddhist perspective of impermanence as a negative, right? And I tried to explain that to these tours, and it just didn't seem to resonate. These people hear about the truth of impermanence, right? One of the only universal truths is that nothing lasts, right? Everything is transforming, coming or going, impermanence. But people see this as a negative because we think of what we love, what we hold dear, our attachments. But we forget that same as good is bad. And when you see the perspective of impermanence in beyond good and evil, it's Nietzsche's internal return, right? When you realize that, and this is exactly what this book that I'm talking about here, this Simply Nietzsche, very clearly, this is one of my favorite parts that he explains. The real truth here is to find this path through these hypocrisies, these dualistic perspectives, into a true non-dual perspective. That's the liberation. It's incredible the amount of influence that Indian philosophy has had on Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Kant, you name it, but here is it, right here, this truth, even of Maya, that life is all strictly perspective, as Schopenhauer, and this is what Nietzsche loved about it, that this idea that will, right, that's what we attach to, what we believe in, what we want, what drives us. But also perspective, right? It's no different than the Yogacara or the Shaivist or the Vedantin perspective, that all of life is perspective, right? Because we are biased, but also viewing and experiencing the world in a little prison, right? A little jail, as I said. But yeah, so that's our goal. Be it kasina practice in Buddhism, where if you begin to see how close our imagination is to reality from our perspective, it can change your understanding, your perspective, and maybe even allow you, as Nietzsche was hoping, to break out of these bonds, that reactive tradition, whatever you want to call it, when we're not actually thinking for ourselves, choosing for ourselves, and creating a new table of values for ourselves based on need and reality, form and function, both.